everybody, how are you? Back again with another video about Omaha, and this is the latest in our series on this great city in the heartland. Now this video we're going to talk about the neighborhoods because really isn't a community made up of its building blocks, which are the neighborhoods, completing the tapestry of the fabric of a city are the threads of its citizens in neighborhoods. And now, if you're new to the channel, new to these videos, 99% of this I'm about to make up off the top of my head. So if you're coming in from the Google machine or the YouTuber search looking for a real video on this topic, this is not it. This is me making things up off the top of my head because honestly, I'm lonely. I don't have a lot of friends, and this gives me something to do. It's also part of my program to maintain sanity. So with that in mind, let's talk about the neighborhoods in Omaha. And of course, we've talked about how this city is a linchpin of the development of this country, because one of the key railroads was started right here, right in Omaha, and allowed the westward expansion of the country at such a rapid pace that it became one of the most powerful and successful economic miracles in the history of the world. So Omaha is a very important city, and the people in it are as well. Now, as we learned in the 1800s and 1900s, things were kind of rootin' tootin' rockin' sock'em. It was just like much of the West, and probably in a lot of areas in the development of this country, it wasn't always rainbows and unicorns. And the Wild West was, in fact, that wild, and Omaha was, in a lot of ways, the frontier to much of the eastern seaboard. And the reason that they started the linchpin of the beginning of the railroad in Omaha was that there was no bridge coming from Council Bluffs. So, they may have started it on the other side of the Missouri River had they had a bridge, but remember, the things were still developing. Things that we take for granted now, like bridges, weren't always that plentiful back in those days. So the city has developed into some distinct neighborhoods like Little Boot. Now, Little Boot is a kind of a cowboy enclave. It's where a lot of the cowboys that were, a lot of the work hands and you might call them the soldiers of the development of Omaha, because they were the ones that were building the gas lines, digging the trenches, building that one bridge that they finally did, building the buildings, roping the cattle, driving the cattle to market, getting them on the boxcars, getting them ready to be sent back east for consumption by all of those Yankees in Boston and Providence and Philadelphia and New York City. So the cowboys, although Omaha really had a cattle background from way back because it was a big stockyard, all right, and that's where they kept the cattle and corralled them until they were going to market, a lot of times on trains. And sometimes if they couldn't catch a train, now let's say the cattle couldn't catch a train, a lot of times they would just get a car. They would take a car. And this is in the early days of the car, so they couldn't fit a lot of cows on there. And in fact, sometimes if they had to get a car to get some cattle, so let's put it this way. Let's say you had 4,000 head of cattle. You drove them on a cattle drive from Texas all the way up to Omaha. You got 3,995 of them on the boxcars, on the train, to go to New York City. But now you have 5 strays that didn't get on because they have attitude problems. What are you going to do? You're going to drive them in a car. Now, the problem was that cars weren't invented yet, so you had to build your own car. And in that case, you couldn't go. Now, even if you did that, and you couldn't go yourself, so you had to teach one of the cows to drive the car. And then you had to trust that they're going to drive themselves all the way to New York City. And so it took a lot of time and it took a lot of expertise, and that's why the cowboys, really developed their own community in Boot Town. And Little Boot Town has been known in that area as a working class area of cowboys and other people in that cowboy world, the rustlers and the cooks that would cook on the cattle drives, the blacksmiths, right? All of the corollary industries that supported the cowboy, and that including shootouts in the middle of the street outside the saloon at high noon. Now, you had to have some instruction on that. You couldn't just, people think, oh, they were just playing cards and there's an argument and they're like, meet me outside at high noon and we're going to we're going to draw. Well, that is a special skill, even if you're a marksman, even if you're a person that's got a great shot. It's an another level of pressure to go out at high noon and draw on another person. So they had in Omaha, this was happening so much in Omaha in the early days, that they had a special night school that they asked that you take the classes in before you went out there at high noon to draw on another person. So you had to learn how to handle the glint of the sun. Do you think they had Polaris sunglasses in those days? No. And let's be honest, your cowboy hat didn't really diffuse the light enough to allow you to take it in an exact shot. So you had to train your brain and train your eye to the conditions of the high noon draw. And that's what these night classes were all about. Now, we're not talking about a 3-month real estate licensing course, right? This was just like 2 or 3 nights where you went to a class, it was held in the saloon. They had a special classroom to the side there, even though they kept serving drinks in the class during the class. There you had an instructor that would teach you how to handle the sun, how to handle the pressure of the crowds, all right, how to, even if you didn't have a clear idea of where your target was, how to best use your optical nerve to focus in on a blob in the distance, because remember, the heat of the sun would come off of the sand in the middle of the sand and the dirt and the mud. The heat would come off it in these waves, and so your target may look like a wavy blob in the distance. Well, they teach you to use your optic nerve to triangulate that blob so that when you shoot, you're shooting in the middle of that triangulation. So these are a lot of skills that people don't realize, and that was all developed by the cowboy community and their support services. So that's why they had to have a support system that worked for them, and they developed that in Little Boot Town. Now, as a neighborhood that was very close by, that was distinct from that, was the financial services that supported the cowboy community, the stockyard community, the industries that were related to that. And that was the Little Bank. Little Bank neighborhood is all of the bankers that developed in Omaha in the early days. And it was distinct in Omaha because they wore these brown bowler hats and they had armbands. And some of them even had these visors, these green visors they'd wear, because they heard from some of their friends down in Texas that was kind of the fashion of the banking community. They'd have these green visors, or in addition, they might have these lamps that had a green shade on them. So they were trying to communicate this idea of money, that we're stable, we're steady, that you can put your money into our banks. And, for a long time, that was the farthest thing from the truth, because some of these guys would pull this scam for many years where they were stable, they were trustworthy, and this was a long con. Some of these, in the early days of Omaha, some of these long con bankers would put up this front like, we are the reliable person for you to give us your money, and then we'll repopulate that money through the Omaha economy, and therefore develop a stable banking system. Well, they would pull this con for like 10 years, and then all of a sudden you go to put in your money that you won at the poker tables, and old Sam, the banker, is gone. There's no furniture in the bank. The only thing is these pens they would have, they're dangling from the chain. inside the bank, still swinging from the motion, the speed with which the banker absconded with your money and that of all of your friends and associates. And they would hightail it to St. Louis and start all over. This was a scam that was perpetuated throughout the West, is the long con banker. But you figure a banker in those days lived to be maybe 42, 43 years old. They could pull the con probably 2-3 times in their lifetime and live the life of a fairly well-off, upper middle class Westerner without drawing a gun once. But it took a lot of savvy, it took a lot of patience more than anything else. Well, they had their own community called Lil Bank, and it was right next to Lil Boot, right there in the insides of Omaha. We're talking in the early days, right around downtown, what people consider downtown. That's where a lot of these neighborhoods started, of course, because that's where the town itself began and expanded from this centralized area, of course, like all downtowns or cities growing from a central area. And that's why you can still go to these neighborhoods today. So now, if you look on, there was a very popular area to get seafood, believe it or not, seafood, and it's called Lil Shrimp. And the seafood purveyors at the time would get their food from these river boats coming up the Missouri River. So they would, in other words, pull shrimp and that from the Gulf of Mexico and run it up the Mississippi to where it intersected with the Missouri and then on up to the Missouri. Now, to keep this seafood fresh, you'd have to have unbelievable amounts of ice. And so that's why New Orleans, half their economy in the early days was based on ice houses and the ability to put ice onto these river boats that ran up and down the Mississippi and the Missouri on the way up to Omaha, and even all the way up to cities farther north of Omaha on up to the Northwest Passage. But, the idea was to have fresh seafood, and so you had shrimp, you had lobster, you had crabs, and a lot of times people would even ask for sushi, which was rare to get, mainly because nobody really knew how to prepare it. And if you've ever had sushi that was prepared by somebody that works at a gas station or something like that, you're in for a world of hurt, okay? You need to have a special guy that was a guy or girl from Japan that knew how to slice and dice it, knew how to prepare it, knew how to get it going. And so a lot of times these river boats would hire naturalized Japanese cooks and sous chefs and sushi chefs just for that reason. They'd have a sushi bar on the riverboat. And, honestly, a lot of people didn't know how to order it properly. And to this day, I see it even in Los Angeles, people ordering sushi as if they're ordering a Big Mac. It's not the same. Now, it helps if you just are open to experience, because you're going to be served sometimes, if you're adventurous, they're going to serve you some sushi that you've never seen before, and it doesn't even look like sushi. But trust me, it's good, and they're going to take care of you. Well, all that was also taking place in the early days in Omaha on the river boats. And that's why Lil Shrimp was this entire area of seafood restaurants that people loved, especially cowboys. Because look, you go out and driving cattle for 4 months. What do you eat out there on the prairie? Yeah, cattle. You eat food. You eat beef. Well, come on. By the time you get back to Omaha, you're just hankering for some fresh lobster. You're hankering for some shrimp and some crab, okay? And so that's why that area, what they call Lil Seafood, was such a popular part of town. So you had Lil Boot, you had Lil Bank, and you had Lil Seafood. These were some of the really prominent neighborhoods in Omaha in the early days that exist to today. Now, let's go through 2 more, and then in the future videos, we're going to talk to some of the people in these neighborhoods and find out how they developed and how Omaha became such an important part of the development of the West as the country expanded. So the fourth one of the 5 neighborhoods we're going to talk about in this video was a place that was kind of unknown to a lot of people, even in the city of Omaha, which was not that big. But again, there wasn't any trolley system in the early days. There wasn't any buses. There wasn't any, mass transit. You may not even know somebody that lived 5-6 blocks away in your own neighborhood. Like, let's say you lived in Little Boot. You may not know all the cowboys in your own neighborhood, much less a neighborhood that was, across the river, let's say, or across town. You may not even know. And so that's why some of these neighborhoods weren't as well known. They're a little more obscure. And one of them that probably a lot of the cowboys, for example, wouldn't even know about was Lil Hat. Now, Lil Hat were these guys that they fancied themselves to be the upper class of Omaha. And so, in a working class town like that, where everybody is in meatpacking or cowboying or drawing at high nooning, these kind of activities, jobbing, wholesaling, they didn't look too kindly on people that walked around with bowler hats on and white shirts that were pressed, they were ironed. People that, when you look down at their boots, even if they had boots on, they were shined up and there wasn't any dirt on them. Well, that's the way that these fancy pants in the neighborhood of Lil Hat lived, right? And they had the big homes. And what it was a lot of the leaders, the industrial leaders, the owners, the management, the upper middle class or rich of the town lived in Lil Hat. And sure enough, they all wore hats and they had this kind of a bowler look to them. It wasn't quite the English bowler hat that you're thinking of. It was kind of a Wild West bowler hat. So think of a bowler hat that was flattened out on the sides like a cowboy hat. You might almost think of it as a mini cowboy hat. So think of a regular size cowboy hat. Well, this is a third of the size. And they walked around with these hats on. Sorry. I wasn't going to break. You broke. You said you weren't going to break and you broke. So they walked around with these miniature cowboy hats on, pretending that they were rough and tough and rootin' tootin', trying to fit in with their regular folk, but at the same time, they were the financiers and the industrial leaders that were limiting the expansion of unions that were, right? So they tried to fit in, they tried to be regular folk, let's say, and yet the way they dressed, the way they spoke, and the way they conducted business was anything but regular folk. They were not on the side of the blue-collar man. And, they wouldn't barely even get outside the neighborhood of Lil Hat. All they did was play golf, play tennis, and ride their expensive horses around town. And the ladies rode side saddle, to give you an idea of how dainty they were. I mean, can you imagine? And some of these places had fox hunting, right? And some of the properties were so big they could ride the hunt on a single property for 5 hours on a Saturday morning, riding the fox hunt, and the ladies would ride side saddle. Now, if you've ever seen a fox hunt on TV or whatever, they go really fast. So you're riding a horse across the country. You're basically on a galloping horse on hill and dale, over fences, right, over barbed wire, over little creeks and little clumps of stumps, and you're running through the woods. And these ladies were riding side saddle. That means both of their legs were on one side of the horse. I mean, you could barely stay on a horse that's just walking, riding side. They're jumping over jumps. I just don't even know how they did it. Just ridiculous. I don't know. Whoever thought of that? Whoever said that riding side saddle made a lady more modest or ridiculous. So that was Lil Hat, and that's the way the upper middle class and the upper classes lived. And they, like I said, they never really went outside their neighborhood, even though they kept with this delusion that they were part of the common man, part of the common class as well. Yeah, if you want to be part of the common man, you can't have skin on your hands that is as soft and dainty as a baby's bottom. That means you haven't never put in a fence post. You've never roped a horse. You've never had your head kicked in by a bucking bronco. So that is Lil Hat. And the final of our main communities in the early days that are still here. So that's the key. We're talking about neighborhoods that were there in the early days that are still there. And that's Lil Cut. Now, Lil Cut is an area where you went to get a haircut. Because the problem with the West was that you couldn't carry all these tools when you're on the cattle drive. When you're a lonesome, rambling man of the gun, meaning a marksman, a sharpshooter, a maverick, you couldn't carry every little tool that you right? You had to carry one tool, so you might have a 12-in-1 Swiss Army knife. But even those Swiss Army knives with the scissors on them, well, that might cut a thread that you were using to mend a tent or a sleeping bag. But that scissors wasn't good enough to cut your hair. So that was the problem in the early days of Omaha, is that nobody could get a good haircut until the city leaders focused on it. They developed the industry, and then all of those haircutters, barbers, and salon stylists started to congregate and live and work in their own neighborhood called Lil Cut. So anybody in town that wanted a haircut, they would go to Lil Cut, and they'd go in, and of course, you're talking about having 50 to 60 haircutting places within a 3-block area. So every one of them had some play off the words of hairstyling or haircutting, just like today. Every hair salon that you see today has some play on words that has to do with hairstyling or haircutting, right? Like hair today, gone tomorrow, right? That kind of play on words. Well, that was a law in the city that you had to have some corny phrase as the name of your salon. And that's one reason why people say that trend has persisted today. A lot of people blame Omaha and the city ordinance that required you to have some goofy name for your salon. Rather than just Joe's Barbershop or Sally's Salon, you had to have some crazy, name related to hair. Some kind of pun. All right. And Lil Cut is still there. You can still get a haircut today. Now, the prices have gone up. In those days, it was a nickel to get a haircut. Today, it's more like $50 to get a nice one. I mean, you could get the discount haircut. If you're paying below $6 for a haircut, well, you might as well have just gone home after a stop at Walmart to get a wall trimmer, WAHL trimmer, and then just cut it all off yourself, because that's what it looks like happened when you get your $5 haircut at the salon. All right, but you got to spend at least $10. Come on. But still today, you can go to Lil Cut, and the speed and efficiency and effectiveness of the teams that work in those salons, and they're all interconnected. So if you have a difficult head to cut hair, it's no problem. They're going to walk you down 3-4 blocks to a place that can handle it, to a specialist. So let's say your head is shaped kind of like a macaroon, or you have some ears maybe that stick out like bow tie pasta, that a regular hair cutter or a regular hairstylist, maybe they can't handle that. Well, then they know who to refer you to. Okay, and that's one of the beauties of Lil Cut is they have specialists that can handle everything. So in other words, once you go inside the boundaries of the neighborhood, you can breathe a sigh of relief because no matter what your hair is, no matter what you want done, no matter what ridiculous picture that you bring in and you say, I would like this haircut. You know, people cut out pictures from magazines or they do screenshots on their phone of these models and movie stars, and they bring them into the hairstylist and they say, I'd like this haircut. And yet their own natural hair can never, ever be shaped into that style that they want. They just want to look like one of the Kardashians or one of the they want to look like Kylie Jenner, and yet their hair is such that not in a million years could it ever be molded, shaped, or wheedled or knitted or sewn into that shape, and the person just living a delusional life. Well, these specialists in Lil Cut, they'll be able to handle it. So really, I'd say even if you live in Austin or Nashville, Miami or Seattle, and you have problems with your hair, go to Omaha. They have an entire neighborhood that is devoted to cutting your hair and doing a good job, no matter how delusional you are, because they also have counselors that will work with you in adjusting your picture of reality and getting a blend of your mental game and also what can be done in reality with your hair. So guys, those are the 5 neighborhoods that still exist today that were there at the very beginning of the city as it developed in the 1800s and on into the 1900s and through to today. Well, listen, come on back. We've got so many more videos on Omaha. We're going to finish it out the end of this week. And then eventually, of course, these videos will be turned into articles, which will then become part of a book called Joe Ditzel Has Some Problems in Omaha, part of the Joe Ditzel Has Some Problems series. Again, if you came into the video in the middle and you're not exactly sure what's going on, this is stuff that I just make up off the top of my head. So please do not use it for your master's thesis. Do not use it for research for your senior paper. Do not use it for research for a book report, because you will get kicked out of school. If you use any of this material, they're going to look at it one time and they're going to know that it came from me, and you will be immediately expelled.